guest speaker for today. Our guest speaker for today is Kathryn Desplanque. Kathryn is currently a Post-doctoral Fellow for Faculty Diversity in the Art Department at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Kathryn is an art historian and specialist in 18th and early 19th century French visual culture, printed imagery, and art markets. Kathryn also has her undergraduate degree in studio arts from Concordia, an MA in art history from Carleton University, and she recently completed her PhD in art history at Duke University. Welcome, Kathryn.
Hi, thank you. And hi to everybody who's out there listening in cyberspace. So today I'm going to be talking to you about my research in NVivo and how I've used it for image analysis. And we're really going to be walking through quite personally how I've gone about this particular research project and how the work that I've done in NVivo relates to the work that I do elsewhere in my career, in my dissertation writing, in my preparation of a book manuscript, in conference papers and whatnot, to kind of give you a sense of how NVivo has, for me, fit quite seamlessly into a larger kind of trajectory and academic sphere. And so my goal here is really to walk you through my project specifically, rather than speak generally about what NVivo can do for absolutely anyone. And I hope that gives you some sense of how that could be useful to you in your work. I'm going to be walking through my former dissertation project and now book project here with you today. So what I want to accomplish is tell you a bit about that research project. I want to tell you about the types of images that I examined. And I want to discuss the larger theoretical and methodological goals that I had for that project. And I want to sort of trace from there into how QDA software revealed itself to me as something that could help me achieve those theoretical and methodological goals, but also from a very practical standpoint could help me deal with the challenges of studying images in high volume. And I want to identify some of the challenges I ran into that pointed to a need for a more advanced image database tool, and these might be very familiar challenges to many of you today. I want to tell you a bit about how I use NVivo for image analysis and research in this PowerPoint show, and I'll continue to do that when I take you into my NVivo project itself. But in this PowerPoint show, what I want to tell you about are the direct and indirect roles that my NVivo project file has in my research output. How does the work that I do here manifest itself in my scholarly output? And lastly, I'm going to take you into my NVivo project itself, and I want to show you some of the stages of going about image analysis in NVivo as somebody in the humanities. How do I relate my images to bibliographic information? How do I code or annotate or tag these images? What are some strategies for exploring my findings in NVivo? And then the most useful part of my NVivo project for me is how I query my metadata to produce these kind of sophisticated and narrow responses to questions that I translate into language that NVivo can understand. So let's start with introducing my research project. This is my dissertation title, Art, Commerce, and Caricature, Satirical Images of Artistic Life in Paris from 1750 to 1850. And this is indeed what I studied. I tried to find as many as possible, and at a certain point I found, I think, almost too many satirical images of artistic life between this date range. And I was interested in images that satirized creators of art, painters, sculptors, architects, that also attacked passive audiences of art, experts, critics, and audiences that viewed this work in different public and private settings and made comment about it and criticism. I was also interested in more active consumers of this work, patrons, buyers, and art dealers. And I should caution you now, this is not the first posterior that will appear in my presentation, so be warned. And lastly, I was also really interested in what I called gatekeepers of the art world, arts administrators, judges, who contribute to arbitrating whether or not some artwork or some artist gains entry to the art world in the first place. The theoretical background to this, for me, was primarily drawn from the sociology of art. Howard Becker and Pierre Bourdieu are contributors to this field, and some of their writings really inspired me to think differently about my approach to satirical imagery and what it could tell us about art worlds. So in a way, my object of study straddled the satirical images themselves, but also the organizational activity of the art world or artistic field, to use Bourdieu's terminology. I really enjoyed this line from Becker's preface to the second edition of his Art Worlds book. Field workers know the complaints are especially good data about organizational activity, and that was a very influential quote to me. But I was also interested in I also am interested in Bourdieu's notion of position taking, that admission to an art world or cultural sphere involves a kind of power struggle. And I wanted to see how the imagery that I study engages in that power struggle and helps to reveal it to us by criticizing and satirizing the conditions and terms by which something is or isn't deemed art, by which an artist is or isn't deemed an artist. And who gets to decide this? What are the terms of appreciation? How does appreciation versus the market factor into these choices? So I had a really kind of ambitious trajectory for what I wanted these images to help me accomplish. And methodologically, I also wanted them to help me bridge two spheres of humanistic inquiry that are often dealt with separately or only gesture to one another. I wanted to be able to deal with cultural history and social history and watch them interweave. So I was interested in marrying this history of discourse to a history of structural relations. And my challenge as I was conceiving of this project, the challenge that I really ran into is, how was I going to make 487 images help me do that? And so it began to become clear to me over the course of my dissertation work that my images demonstrated a kind of evolution of artistic typologies over time, and that this evolution of artist typologies was really revelatory of structural relations and their precarity and their transformation across political regimes. So to give you a kind of very schematized sense of how my research shows that this evolved over time, in the Ancien Regime, for instance, we might see more representations of an artist who seems very, very comfortable and isn't indebted or financially struggling. Between the Revolution and Consulate, we'd be more likely to see a noble yet struggling artist. And then I was really interested in the emergence of a trickster painter type who seems to be attempting to kind of con everyone into believing that they're a high-value artist. And in the Empire and Restoration, for instance, I saw those types branch further and further. Of course, the quantity of images for each period continued to increase. And so that also influences the number of types I found. But I found this noble yet struggling artist branch into a struggling and disillusioned artist who didn't believe that their struggle would yield results, and a struggling and delusional artist who still really believed that they were just a genius waiting to be uncovered. And I also saw the trickster painter break up into these different types: art students, carefree artists. This is what Sans Souci and Rapin referred to. And so NVivo started to emerge as a tool that could really help me to trace these genealogies and to also understand how these genealogies were manifesting themselves concretely in my imagery, and make arguments about that. So I want to tell you a bit about why I turned to QDA software. A lot of this actually had to do quite simply with library cataloging challenges. I think those of you that work on images especially understand that if you are finding them in the library, they may not be cataloged individually, especially if you're finding them in really high volumes. So in my case, none of my images were cataloged individually, and I needed to basically build a library catalog for these 500 some images to be able to work with them meaningfully, since my images needed to be found by diving into kind of likely call numbers and then pulling out those images that were relevant to me. So I did all the cataloging myself, and that on its own generated a huge paper trail that was very difficult for me to grapple with. And then on top of that, I also wanted to record observations. I wanted to make notes. I wanted to interpret each of these individually. So here's a screenshot that may look familiar to some of you. By year 3, year 4 of my PhD, I was really drowning in notes and drowning in photographs. So on this side, I've pictured a screenshot of a kind of failed attempt to put all my images in Dropbox. That was very, very short-lived. But I wanted to show you that I would have images, many times individual art objects I studied. I was drowning in huge amounts of notes where the system and my file man meaningful with the collection that I had started to amass, and had actually become a kind of obstacle to productivity, very frustratingly. So I really needed a solution if I wanted to finish this dissertation in under a decade. So after quite a lot of reflection and a lot of experimentation with other types of image databases, I realized over the course of this kind of back and forth between my research and different forms of databases that I was primarily interested in 3 types of information, and I wanted the distinctness of those 3 buckets of information to be recognized by whatever software I was using, and then I wanted them to all be interrelated. So I had photographs of my satirical images. I was recording, I was reproducing this kind of library catalog, so I also had this bibliographic information that I was recording in heightened detail. And then this third phase that I felt was going to be really instrumental to my research was to be able to annotate my images in some way. I wanted to be able to record patterns I was noticing. I wanted to decipher iconography. I wanted to identify targets and victims of the satire in my imagery. And it was very challenging for me to find a software that would really allow me to do all 3 of these things in a very customizable environment that didn't require a lot of micromanagement. So briefly, I explored the kind of obvious answer that many of you are probably given when you ask around about this, which is to construct your own relational database and Microsoft Access or FileMaker. And this is something that I learned to do in preparation for this project, and that I really carefully considered, but my other experience in relational databases had taught me that relational databases require very minutious architectural micromanagement to preserve the relationship, not just between 3 types of data, but every subset within that data. And if you suddenly make any kind of change to how you want this architecturally to be related, you really need to do quite a lot of legwork to make sure that that the relational database will still function, that it'll still query the way that you want it to, that it'll still understand the relationship between things. And I found that I felt that micromanagement was going to become a second dissertation in and of itself. Another obvious answer would be collection management software. This is software that all museums and collections use to keep records of all of the objects that they have, and where those objects are in space, and who they're by, and when they were produced. So the most obvious answer to that is TMS, the museum system, or Luna Imaging is another option. Interestingly, I actually found, even though I'm in art history, those softwares were very, very difficult for me to actually get a hold of, and to this day, I've still never been able to experiment in any of them. University has its own institutional licenses, and at my university, NVivo was amongst them because the social sciences use it. Museums have their own set of institutional licenses that aren't shared with the broader university community. So unless I wanted to pay for it out of pocket, and these systems can cost hundreds to thousands of dollars, it seemed to me as though it was prohibitive and impossible. It has similar capabilities to NVivo that are tailored to images, but not as customizable. And I'm going to highlight in a moment the reason, when we go into NVivo itself, I'll highlight why that customizability was really instrumental to me in terms of annotations and both bibliographic information, which led me back to NVivo again. So NVivo presented itself to me actually by somebody in library staff, recommended it to me since they were dealing with social sciences, STEM, and humanities. They knew about the software and they could tell me about it. I started to investigate it. and I realized that it really would allow me to keep these three types of data in their own buckets. The premise of qualitative data analysis software, QDA software, is that you have sources, the sources can be described, and then you're going to want to produce more subjective descriptions of them. So there was already room for me to import my sources into NVivo. It assumed that there was room for me to import a spreadsheet with bibliographic information, which NVivo calls a class. Each of these records would be linked to the corresponding image. There is also room for me to annotate these images using in NVivo, but nodes or Facebook or to hashtagging, you can define a structure of tags or nodes, and then you can code them or tag a region of the image. So here I'm showing you the results of all of the bourgeois people that I tagged. In my images, here's my bourgeois guy. This is a painter guy. He's not tagged as bourgeois, so only this individual is highlighted when I call back up those findings. So this structure was extremely useful to me. At this point, it had become apparent to me that there was just absolutely no way I was going to remember what I had seen across 487 images, no matter how much I loved them. So this node structure was instrumental. So to summarize, NVivo allowed me to import these three different types of information, and most importantly, they would all be interrelated to one another. And I'm going to demonstrate what that looks like and what that means for you in NVivo itself. This interrelationship was absolutely vital to me. I knew that there were different ways I was going to remember images and want to find them back, different subsets of images that it might occur to me to call up and explore as a miniature collection. And these were all things that I could do here, since these three buckets of information were all hyperlinked to one another. As an analytical tool, I also appreciated that NVivo let me import notes that I was taking elsewhere. So I produced this spreadsheet, for instance, in Excel. While I was in the libraries, I would take those bibliographic notes in Excel, and then I simply imported that spreadsheet into NVivo. But I think most importantly, for those of you considering broader digital humanities applications, I can export everything from NVivo as a spreadsheet or a CSV file, a comma-separated value file. And those types of files are really the lingua franca for anything more sophisticated you might want to do in web presentation or interactive data visualizations. And so that exportability was really vital to me. I could also kind of tailor what I wanted to export by running these queries, and I'll show you how I've done that. But you can also do data visualization within NVivo itself to explore your findings in different ways. So lastly, before we move into NVivo, how does NVivo itself figure directly and indirectly in my research? It figures indirectly in my research, both in my dissertation and outside of it, by allowing me to find back my images by categories that are meaningful to me. So if I'm writing a presentation and I have on the representation of artists as monkeys, I've tagged all of the monkeys in my images, and I can call back up all the images that I've tagged for monkeys and scroll through them and really look at this customized gallery of objects that are relevant to a single purpose that I have for a presentation, for instance. So as just a gallery tool, it helps me immensely in my writing. I can have that open on one screen, I can be writing on the other screen, and it's kind of a dream. More directly, NVivo, the product of many of my queries, have actually featured in my dissertation research, and I want them to feature even more in my book manuscript. And this is a kind of a visual object that art historians aren't really used to having in their literature. But it became really important to me to really be able to qualify statements about some or many or few or a lot that we tend to make in our research, especially if we're working with large volumes of images. So I wanted to be able to show that lithography eclipsed intaglio around the turn of the 18th to 19th century through this subset of images that I had, and I could do that by running a query and then exporting those findings into Excel and turning them into a graph that I could then put into my dissertation. if I wanted to justify, and I did want to justify in my dissertation, why I was mostly looking at artists and painters, I could reveal, as I have here, that painters for each period, each of the 4 larger periods I defined, make up the majority of social types that figure in my images. So I could really substantiate why my research was taking one direction or another, why I was mostly talking about lithography here, why I'm mostly talking about painters there. And so I really appreciated that kind of, that extra valence and that sort of methodological push that NVivo permitted me to do. Now, in the time that we have left, I want to spend some more time with you in the database itself. So let me switch our screen over to the database. Give me just 1 second. Here we are. So we're in NVivo now. Let me just make sure you can see it. There we go. So this is my NVivo file. The NVivo environment is kind of constructed to look similar to your Microsoft Office suite. And so you have these kind of tabs that we now have in the Microsoft Office suite. And there are additional views here to the left, different types of data that are kind of compartmentalized. So those 3 types of data I talked to you about, my sources, my tags or nodes, and my bibliographic metadata or classification sheets are these top 3 here. So right now we're looking at the sources that I have here, and the sources that I've actually imported straight into NVivo are all of the images that I found, all 486 of them. And so I wanted to point out 2 things while I was here. Firstly, if you do want to bring all of your images into NVivo, and this was the option I preferred, I wanted it as streamlined as possible, you're probably going to want to find a way of making your images a smaller file size so that you don't end up with a really bloated project file. And so I did this using image compression software, which you can kind of find anywhere online. You can look on cnet.com and see what they recommend. Before I compressed all my images, I resized them all. And I did a couple of rounds of resizing to see what resizing and compression combination still permitted for a legible image. So let me just open up one of my images and show you. I batch resized my images in Photoshop. That sounds librarian. They'll probably know exactly what but I batch resized my images in Photoshop, and I never saved over any of my images. So I have about 8 versions of my collection in different sizes and file sizes across my computer. But this was large enough for me to read while conducting this work in NVivo. And if it wasn't, I could call up the full-size image easily on my computer. The other important thing I wanted to point out are file naming conventions. As you can see, these are the file names displayed below each of the thumbnails of my images, and each of them has a unique file name. The file naming convention that I used doesn't need to be universal. I have obviously several close-ups of each image that I didn't import into NVivo, but each of the primary versions of the image I labeled with an M, and the other ones I labeled with an R and a number. And then the MC or below the BNF just refers to the collection I found the image in, the Musée Carnavalet or the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. But the most important part of my file naming convention is actually just the unique number that each of them is assigned, and none of them share it. This file naming convention is really important. Instead of having a kind of a more human readable file naming convention with a title, for instance, this is a really wonderful computer readable file naming convention that allowed the computer to recognize that each image was correlated to a row in my spreadsheet. And so NVivo paired up all of these rows with the corresponding image itself because I rigorously used this file naming convention to the images that then featured in the first column of my spreadsheet. So here I am in my classification sheet for these objects. And I defined a very customized list of bibliographic information I wanted to record. And it's customized because I'm not just working on printmaking, I'm also working on graphic satire, which means that I'm working on it across a period where the medium keeps changing. And so being able to customize this list was very useful to me. Often I couldn't provide an exact date, well, actually a little less often than I originally thought. And so being able to specify a date range turned out to be really useful for my research. The conventions of printmaking change across my period, so sometimes I can define just an artist, and sometimes I am also defining an engraver or an illustrator or another figure involved in the production of the image. So the customizability of this was really important, not just for the medium I studied and not just for the medium in the period I studied, but also for the specific type of object in the medium of the period I studied. And that sounds really convoluted, but I hope a lot of you art historians out there are nodding vigorously, because we all have these weird particularities in our specific subfields. So I appreciated this, and I feel this is an advantage over a collection management software, which might have expectations for how an art object should be described that don't necessarily fit all types of art objects everywhere. And so I was able to define a variety of things here, most importantly for me now, how to find these images back, what were their call numbers, since they hadn't been individually cataloged before. And this, and so I can go further, and then I can set as many parameters as I want, really. So I'm going to go to medium here, I'll have them on their own. This are my images. What I always want to come back to. What I want to show you now is my code structure, my node structure. And I'm just going to close some of these for the sake of simplicity. These are my nodes in NVivo. This is the we needed to, but I got a little greedy, and I came up with all of these in advance, including their hierarchy. And I drafted this list in a Word document, tested for redundancy, for categories I might want to look for that seemed sort of useless, that might not have that many objects that corresponded to them, like tail pulling. I only found 2, but I'm glad it's there anyways. And then I could input it here into my node structure really, really easily by just kind of right-clicking and adding a new node, and then sort of dragging that under different hierarchies. The hierarchical aspect of this list is something that really attracted me to NVivo specifically. When I'm running a query, for instance, I might sometimes be interested in defining visual artists who are painters who are bohemians and coming down to the specific subset of 27. At other times, I might be interested in a comparison at a higher list level, like painters, and I want that to capture everything that I've coded as a subset of painter. So when I define a new node and I place it in coding from child nodes or not, which basically means that visual artist aggregates all the coding from architect, other visual artist, painter, printmaker, sculptor, and student, or not. You know, when I get all the way up to human figures, I have not asked it to aggregate. It shows that there are 0 sources and references to it. So what I want to do now that we're all the way down into painter, I want to show you that this is live to my images again. So I can double click the architect node and open up those 2 instances of architects that I found. It looks like something has paused. I think NVivo is not responding right now. I think I'm overloading my computer. So let me keep chatting and see if it figures itself out. There we go. So it's figured itself out. You guys are all here. Patience with computers usually pays off. So what I really appreciate is that I can call up those 2 records of the architect, for instance. I can click down to this picture tab and then see this in a kind of gallery format with that architect highlighted. And in some cases, I've coded for things so detailed and minutious that having that highlight there has actually proven really useful. What I want to show you briefly is that as how I've coded these parts of the image, what the kind of workflow is for that. So I'm going to jump back into sources, and I'm going to pull up one of my sources once it loads. I'll pull up this guy again. Trusty old L'entrée au musée. So I defined my node structure in advance. I can use the results of my coding to dive back into the images that I found. And I can also continue coding if I want to by simply dragging and extending out a bounding box around a part of the image. So I've chosen this man's hat, and I want to code this for being a hat. I've previously defined different vocabulary that uses the key term hat, and it returns all of that to me, kind of bohemian eclectic. And then I'll click here for, and coding is really just kind of that simple, and it's notified me that it's coded at that node. And attribute settings and symbols that they've been looking at before. I realized that categories that I'd placed under attributes should probably go. In some cases, I tried to categories I built that I had only found one entry for and that I wasn't sure was going to have very much analytical value, and was just an expression. To me, this is one of the major and kind of carve through to find objects to continue writing about, to substantiate arguments, to conduct visual comparisons. And I think what really surprised me about the process of actually coding each individual image is I found it encouraged me to look much more closely at these images than I had previously, even though by the time I came to NVivo, I'd been working on these images for years. And so I noticed things in many of my images that I had never noticed before, and that proved in many cases to be quite instrumental in coding, or sorry, quite instrumental in interpreting and decoding my image set and individual images. So I wanted something that could straddle close looking and distant looking, and I really appreciated that NVivo wasn't actually able to look at these images for me at all, but it could kind of note take on how I was looking at them. So what I want to do now in just a couple of minutes is show you two ways that I explore my data sets. And one is genuinely quite exploratory, and the other one is more analytical, and I found more useful for me to repurpose in my writing. One is you can go into this Explore tab and use one of these visualization tools like the hierarchy chart. And I'm going to ask it to show me basically how many images correspond to certain nodes in my image set. So I'm going to jump in, and I just want to see how my visual artists shook out. So I'm going to finish this and let it generate that. What this hierarchy chart is showing me now, there it is, what it's showing me now here on the screen is proportionally how much of each subtype is being coded, the quantity. So I can see that within visual artists, as I showed you before, painters are the most common kind of secondary label, and then students and other visual artists seem to be kind of paired for second place. And within painters, other painters which aren't really categorized within these labels, and portraitists really seem to have the most coding references and sources coded to them. So this is kind of useful for me for getting a general sense of what just happened. You know, after you spend a week coding all your objects, you probably have some impression of how much of everything you found, but the numbers are going to look a little different. Human perception is really, I've learned over the course of this project, very, very selective and prone to cherry picking. And so it might notice all the times that you saw a guitar, but you only saw a guitar twice. You actually saw a painter, 136 times, for instance. So this was useful to me to compare what I remembered with what I found. I want to show you in the minutes that we have left before I want to open everything up to questions, what I want to show you is querying. Querying was a really important part of this project for me and how I investigated my collection. There are several queries that I saved, but you can go into this query tab up here and you can run different types of queries. If you're working with text-based sources that are OCR'd, optical character recognition, like a PDF, for instance, are often OCR'd. You can do these text searches and word frequencies, and they're very sophisticated, but my objects are not text-based, so I tended to use these other coding types, especially matrix coding. And I'm going to show you an example of matrix coding result that I've saved already. I looked at the quantity of painters' models by gender and type and by period. So as this query runs, I'm going to explain to you, I coded for female models, male models, and portrait sitters as a distinct category. And there's, of course, overlap between these. And I was interested in seeing how many did I find in general across all of my images, and how many did I find between 1700 and 1800, and how many did I find in the 19th century. And so it's returning all those results to me. In this case, in a spreadsheet, and I can easily copy paste. I can select copy paste that spreadsheet into Excel and do more things with it there. And I can export it too into Excel if I don't feel like copy pasting. I can also view it as a chart once the results have been returned to me, and see how these look if they're visualized as a graph. And each of these components, you notice when I hovered over, change color, and it's because they're also live to that information. So here are all my 18th century female models, and then I can view them as a picture. So this allows me, these matrix queries might actually figure directly in my research. The results of them might be visualized in my research, as you saw in the PowerPoint slide, but often I would simply use them to carve through my coding structure in a more specific way. My coding structure might not parse things by date, but I could have my queries divide things by date afterwards. I can also have my queries divide things by medium. I can really have them divide in almost any way I define. So I'm going to just take a moment to run a matrix coding query so that you can see, because this, I think, can be a bit more of a learning curve. What I'm doing here in the matrix coding query is I'm just defining the rows and, sorry, these are the rows. I'm defining the rows and I'm defining the columns. And I need to kind of anticipate what question I'm asking for it to get an answer to here. So let me come up with a question while we're chatting. I'm going to define what I'm going to put in my rows here. And I'm going to jump into iconography, and I'm going to jump into human figures, types, visual artists, and I'm going to select all of the different types of painter that I have. And I'm going to add them to my list. And what I'd like to know is what are the number of painters that I found for different periods or regimes. And so I'm going to add those to my list. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to rearrange them by chronology, and then I will run this. So this was a really, really useful tool for me in my writing to just dive back into these objects and see what exactly did I find and what does it all mean. And here, this is a little bit difficult to see, so let's get some of these cells shaded so it can show me concentrations. Now, of course, it's important to remember that generally the number of images I found across all categories over time increased as I went up into the July monarchy, so it's not surprising that I'm finding more here in general, but I can look just at the July monarchy list and see what types of painters I'm seeing in the highest concentrations, and whether those are also appearing in the highest numbers within other periods as well, or whether there's some kind of shift in balance that I need to make sure to talk about. And of course, the results of these queries are also live to the information. So let's pull up my Revolution Directory and Consulate History painters, and I can take a closer look at these here. So I think that was probably really overwhelming, but I'm going to stop. I feel like I've actually really only scratched the surface of what I can accomplish in NVivo, even though it's been such a useful tool to me, and I feel like I've invested really heavily in it, especially for this project. And I plan to for future projects. but there's so much more that I can do within this software, different forms of exploration and data visualization that could reveal new relationships in my data set that I haven't even considered looking for or asking about. There are ways that I can export what I've produced here for web format and for interactive data visualizations that I've only just begun to explore. But I hope this gives you a really useful and not altogether overwhelming introduction to the kind of how far you can go in image analysis if you can structure your images in this really useful way for different forms of investigation. Thank you.